originally the piece was actually shown in Toronto for
Right.
the power plant exhibition. I think we were called Bounce. It was like
Yeah, I
a
think so.
3-person exhibition. And so I'd sort of working with this guy who'd done the Tiny Kingdom, which was also being shown in the same exhibition. And I asked him to get me a log, sort of like that you would use, and we were creating this wood pile. But the log wasn't interesting enough, so we kind of modified it. So it's actually like a kind of hybrid. It's like there's like a little sort of the knot thing that's coming off is actually faked.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So you just like glue a knot from another piece of wood onto it? Or
Yeah,
something?
we kind of glued a knot and the bark and sort of attached it and then they kind of puttied in and everything so that it's sort of like. So I have still the original log as well as the plaster cast to test the sort of molds. But the plaster casts have suffered much more damage because I keep moving them everywhere.
Right. So it's this sort of like ideal irregularly shaped log.
Yeah, like I wanted something that kind of like looked like a log, but had something to it that was a little sort of like, it sort of had a nice grain on the sides and everything as well, so you could flip on either side. And
I think I was reading an account that you gave of that show at the power plant where you were saying that you felt like the Tiny Kingdom needed some sort of a moat and you weren't allowed to dig into the floor, so you put a wall up.
Well, I was thinking it's sort of like the Tiny Kingdom was sort of like a castle, and
Right.
and generally with a castle there's some sort of protective sort of surround to that, either a moat or a tall wall. And I'd been reading also Tom Sawyer. No, it wasn't Tom Sawyer, it was Huckleberry Finn.
Okay.
And there's a description of the feud between the Grangerfords and the Shepherdsons, which is actually kind of like the feud between the Hatfields and McCoys. It was kind of inspired by. So anyway, I think what happened was, trying to remember back, but there was an illustration by E.W. Kemble, who illustrated the first edition of The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, and of two kids standing behind this wood pile with guns during this shootout between the Shepherdsons and the Grangerfords. And there was this kind of dynamic that had been set up between Toronto and Vancouver, because at the power plant exhibition there was the 3 artists from Vancouver and then 3 artists from Toronto. And Sarah Milroy had actually written an article in the Globe and Mail sort of suggesting why are artists from Vancouver so much better than artists from Toronto, which didn't go over very well in Toronto. So, but I was also thinking just about, feuding in general and how that sort of works out, I guess. Right. So it's sort of like the Tiny Kingdom being this sort of castle or this kind of monarchy in a way, and then this sort of, protectiveness.
And so it was conceived sort of specifically in relation to that other sculpture.
It was, yeah. Like I was thinking about it as, because for me, this sort of like the Tiny Kingdom was also sort of riffing a little bit on the idea of the folly, like the architectural folly. Right. And inspired a little bit by Dan Graham's writings and Rodney Graham's show that he did at Vexation Island in Venice Biennial in 1997. Because it was sort of like he, in his citing Vexation Island essay for the catalog, writes about the location of the Canadian Pavilion relationship to the other pavilions in the gardens, and the fact that the gardens, you're between England and Germany, the Canadian Pavilion is, and it sort of looks like an outbuilding in a way. And the funny thing about that was that the Canadian Pavilion doesn't have a washroom, so whenever we would have to use the washroom, we'd have to go ask the British if we could borrow their washroom, which I thought was really funny. And so it was sort of like, thinking about these notions of outbuildings, but also outposts and sort of, colonial pasts, right. But also like that architectural folly. And the sort of wood pile became like a second sort of architectural folly. I wanted to do a trilogy. Okay. But I haven't come up with a third folly yet.
So that's still...
It's still out there.
Whose idea was it to put it outside in the first place?
I think it was Scott. Sort of the purchase happened through him. And obviously, it seemed kind of appropriate that it could go outside because it's concrete and, it's a wood pile. I think part of the sort of problem was that there wasn't really the same sort of situation where we could sort of place it between something to act as a barricade. Like we looked at a lot of times they will have, and I've seen this before with actual wood piles between two trees, and the trees will act as brace. And there are two trees just out at the front, but they wouldn't let us do it there, like the sort of plant services or whatever.
Okay.
Thought it would sort of, affect the trees.
Oh, I think I saw a drawing maybe where that was proposed and scratched out in the drawing with pen. So it would have been sort of when you go out the front door to the left.
Yeah, so sort of like would have acted more like a wood pile. So then we just started playing with, where could it go? And, that sort of seemed like a sort of an extension of the architecture in a way.
And so the dimensions is sort of fairly variable in terms of how it would be installed.
It was. I think we wanted it so that it would be installed similarly to how it was installed at the power plant,
Okay.
which meant, and that you would have the hole at a sort of like eye level, and that there would be some, above, it sort of would act as almost a barrier or protective, thing if you had to hide behind it in a way.
Was it up anywhere else in between the two?
It was actually that show traveled to Bellingham for the museum down there that eventually closed.
Okay.
So, yeah.
So I'm just thinking about sort of how it changed by going from being sort of indoors and specifically in relation to another sculpture, and then how the work changed for you maybe by going outdoors in this sort of very different environment.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I thought it was kind of quite interesting that it should move outside because it kind of felt like it should have been outside anyway. As a piece, it's sort of like interesting that there are some works within my, I guess, practice that could work both in a private gallery situation, but also can go outside as well. And this was one of them. I think, the sort of mascot piece, which was an earlier piece, was another one because it was sort of like a mascot costume. And it was installed, it was a performance piece. So it's sort of like I walked around as a mascot during the sort of Melbourne Biennial. And then for the opening, and then afterwards, it was installed, in the gallery, just the empty costume kind of thing on a plinth. So for me, it's sort of like the shift from having it, in this specific exhibition context and then bringing it into this sort of university context, the sort of grounds, sort of added like another layer of sort of meaning to the actual piece. And, thinking about it as a barricade and then that relationship to protesting. And one of the things that was interesting too, because it was also installed actually prior to being purchased up at the Vancouver Art Gallery in a group exhibition that I think Bruce Granville curated, and it was installed in front of Ian Wallace's piece Click What Sound. And it was sort of really interesting to think about it, and not just in the sort of more generic terms as a wood pile with all these references, but also in relationship to the history of BC, the sort of logging and the protests, taking the sort of the imagery of the sort of lone tree that has been so much a part of sort of the history of Canadian art, but also sort of like the West Coast. You think of Rodney Graham's like Upside Down Trees, or Jeff Wall's Pine on the Corner, or Emily Carr's Scorned of Earth, whatever that title is.
Right.
What is the title anyways?
I don't know, but I think I
Yeah,
know the
it's
one you're
just
talking. And I would actually, as you were starting that sentence, I was imagining that tree being hacked down.
Well, yeah, so you think about that sort of like that tree as that symbol, and it's sort of like how it's been played out in different sort of ways in this sort of West Coast art, and thinking about, you know, the totem pole as well, and then thinking about that, the sort of practical or maybe the sort of reality of a sort of less romantic possible view of the tree as a sort of source of fuel, as a source of energy, as you know, something that is a commodity to be bought and traded. And so for me, it was sort of like it sort of, you know, pushed the sort of meaning further in a way, and sort of you know, was kind of quite interesting in that regards.
So maybe that relates somehow to a question about the title that I was sort of thinking of, Wood for the People, where it seems like there's a lot of weight on that word for in the title, where there's, because it seems to relate on the one hand to this sort of ideas that you're talking about the potential for protest and this sort of barrier.
Mm-hmm.
But there's some indication of a potential like generous, you know, like a wood that's for the people, say, to use,
Yeah.
which is undermined by its being
Static
not
and-
conventionally useful.
Yeah. Well, it's funny because I was trying to come up with a title for, titling I find very difficult, you know, because it's such a driver of the meaning of how you interpret the piece a lot of times. And because I'd already actually, you know, knew the exhibition was include the Tiny Kingdom, and then, you know, trying to think about, you know, how to title that. And then it was my nephew, who was about 10 years old at the time, that came up with the title. So we were just sort of like jamming out ideas, and, you know, we came up with a bunch of different ones, and that was the one that kind of stuck. And it sort of made sense in relationship to this notion of, you know, sort of a kingdom or a fiefdom, and then, you know, this notion of a maybe more democratic thing, where it's sort of like the wood is for the people, and it's sort of like, and who defends those sort of that monarchy, and in a way, and who sort of doesn't benefit.
Right.
So yeah.
Yeah, as I was reading the ways that you've talked about sort of the way that pastoral and the idea of the rural plays out in your work, one of the things I kept thinking of with this, especially with the architectural folly, is like Marie Antoinette's hobby farm at Versailles.
Yeah, that was a big sort of like, that was a big influence in thinking about, you know, both those pieces, like the Tiny Kingdom and also, you know, Wood for the People is that tendency, you know, sort of like, but it's also that idea of for the Tiny Kingdom, it's like the idea that the toilet is a throne. But that's a sort of, you know, a euphemism for it. And who was it that said, I think it was de la Montagne, who said, even on the highest throne, we are still sat on our backsides. And for me, it was sort of like very much like, despite how much you elevate yourself, it's sort of like you are still human and part of that sort of people, that mass of people. So yeah, that sort of, there is that kind of interest in that notion of the barricade, and about how they, you know, took the paving stones, and, you know, when, you know, during sort of, you know, the revolutions in Paris, and they created those amazing barricades through, you know, pulling up, you know, what was around them and everything. And I think the same thing in relationship to the wood is almost acts like that too.
In poetry, which is what I know about the pastoral, it's so often about sort of projecting the workings of the court or of like inner politics onto the rural space. So you imagine these shepherds and shepherdesses, you know, who are actually enacting the sort of dramas of a central situation. So when you talk about, you know, Vancouver, Toronto art being projected onto Hatfield McCoy's, for example.
Well, I was also thinking not just about the Toronto-Vancouver thing, but also the internal politics of the Vancouver arts community and everything, which is notorious for certain feuds.
Right.
And it's sort of like, you know, the conceptual sort of, but also, you know, personal. You know, I think it's part of a smaller, you know, local thing, but I think it's also endemic to all sort of artistic communities where there's something at stake. You know, that there's certain things that sort of happen. So for me, I was actually reading a lot about the pastoral, and this notion too, I think it was like my own fantasy about, you know, escaping to the country, and I think that was about, fleeing some of the day-to-day reality and getting back to something that was more simple, which was very much part of this idea of the pastoral, but in that way that it sort of can also, that escape in terms of a fantasy doesn't really sort of work so much.
Well, it seems that you always bring it with you.
Yeah, and I ended up living in the country for 3 months when I was in Scotland, and yeah, it was like, oh, okay, so yeah, I'm not really keen on, I just liking this.
Seems like a lot of mud, maybe.
Yeah, seems like there's not much to buy here. But I was reading quite a few sort of, texts around, pastoralism and, and how to sort of think about those things and that use of irony as well. Because often they're, certain, especially in American pastoral, was very much at a time when sort of industrial sort of revolution was happening, it's sort of like it just sort of precedes that in a way. And you start to think about those kinds of, the more sort of fraught life becomes, the more people are wanting to escape to those kinds of places.
As sort of
where
Walden Pond.
Where they feel, like, I think one of the sort of like, because when I did the Tiny Kingdom, I also did a series of watercolors called the Miss Moonshine series. And a lot of the imagery was drawn from the film Deliverance. And Deliverance is very much about that. It's about that flooding of the valley, and they go on this canoe trip and everything prior to that whole land being sort of flooded, and it's sort of like it's about reconnecting with nature, but then they have these kind of terrible encounters with the sort of fringes, the sort of hillbillies that are living in there, and so you kind of think about what is the reality of actually living in these places. It's sort of it's not that romantic sort of thing that we think it is.
Yeah, I'm just thinking about that element of, sort of the element of threat. I mean, in that case, where what's...
Well, I think it's also terror, too,
right.
Like, I think it's sort of like that you can't escape humanity in the sort of the problems of humanity, no matter what landscape that you're actually, inhabiting, whether you're in the city or whether you're in the country.
So it's the people from the city who are bringing, in that case, who are sort of bringing the threat to the rural situation. I mean, it's about to be destroyed by the sort of cultural form that they're representing.
Yeah, and it's sort of like there is that, that sort of dichotomy between city and country always, and it's how does that play out, in terms of our sort of, I guess, day-to-day lives, but, anyway.
And maybe particularly fraught here, though. I know that you've talked, like in relation to the birds sculpture, about the sort of colonial invasive species, and that's something that often comes up when we're sort of walking people past, talking with groups about the sculptures here, is about sort of how, say, this work would relate to something like the native hosts, those signs that are.
Oh, okay, yeah.
And so that sort of like resource extraction that seems to be indicated by this.
Yeah, I mean, sorry, I had a thought. What was it? You were just saying it about
invasive species, maybe.
Yeah, well, the thing with the invasive species is kind of interesting to me. With the birds, is that it was during a sort of political point when they were talking a lot about immigration in the States, and sort of like there was this similar sort of rhetoric or language around the sort of ecological problem of invasive species, and also the political problem in the U.S. about Mexicans coming in, or whoever they deemed alien, that they were invading us, and this is a threat that we had to protect ourselves against. And for me, that was kind of really interesting, because who really is the alien in this situation? And it's sort of like about how the reason for invasive species is generally something that we've brought with us as we sort of travel, as we migrate around the world.
So you were talking a little bit earlier about the way that you have certain works in your practice that could be in a gallery space and could be in public spaces.
Yeah.
So And I think that as you were saying that, I was thinking of the rabbit ears that were at the Ore Gallery.
Yeah.
For example.
Well, I think a lot of my work functions as like a reflection or thinking about notions of the monument and how the monument works. And it's sort of like the Tiny Kingdom would for the people were also not just follies, but also the not sort of like playing with this idea of the monument and how, how do we sort of slightly commemorate things, but also the power relations that are engendered in sort of monumental sculpture, especially when you take something and put it outside, because it had been, from the private gallery space to the public, it really shifts, how people interact with it, or give it certain kinds of meaning and everything, like that context. So yeah, the rabbit ears was sort of conceived of as a thing that could go outside. I was thinking about, again, that idea of, so maybe this is the third part of the trilogy.
So as sort of working in outdoor public art sculpture lets you, that would be one of the things that it triggers, is letting you think more about that idea of the monument.
Well, it allows me to actually realize things on a different scale, and sort of the idea of the monument becomes real, as opposed to sort of hypothetical. So it's sort of like taking the sort of hypothetical wood pile, as a sort of folly, and then actually transposing it into this, setting. Then actually it makes it a real monument to something in a way. It was weirdly strange too. It's sort of like I noticed a lot of people when they were coming, they were leaving little pebbles on the sort of the wood pile, which is that thing that they do in Jewish cemeteries. Is a sort of like, I'm not entirely sure why they do it, but I'm assuming it's a sort of commemorative thing. But there was all these little pebbles that had been left in the sort of spaces on the sort of wood pile at one point.
Oh, interesting. I
Yeah.
don't think I saw that.
Yeah.
But it makes, people want to have some sort of tactile relationship to the things in public space that seem important.
Yeah, yeah.
And definitely, people want to climb on top of this. And that's something that maybe I also read that you were talking about with the new sculpture at BC Children's Hospital,
Mm-hmm.
where one of the sort of qualities of that is that they're especially tactile or inviting.
Yeah, well, I think it's sort of like after installing the birds and seeing how much people interacted with them to the point where they're actually getting damaged now. And, that was like the big sort of fear of the sort of city. It's just like, we want to avoid that at all costs. We had to adjust the sort of the height of one of the birds, or the angle of one of the birds, so that it would become less of a climbing sort of situation. In fact, it did nothing to sort of stop people from climbing it. It just posed more of a challenge. And so it's sort of like realizing it's like that's how people want to, especially kids, are in the public realm, and it's sort of like to sort of try and build that idea into the sort of work and future works, thinking about like it's sort of like, why is everything about don't touch? I mean, that's very much a situation in the gallery space where it's like you're not allowed to touch the art, you're not allowed to engage with it. You engage with it in a very specific way, that doesn't involve, physicality. So being able to sort of, work in a public space where, it's kind of no holds bar is really great, because it's like you can sort of start thinking, it's like, oh, okay, well, this is actually how people act in public spaces.
Right.
So it's like, why fight it,